Welcome. My name's Jason DeLorme. My co-presenter here, Gil Isaacs, we're both from Microsoft. I manage the business side of the relationship from Microsoft with Pivotal. And Pivotal Cloud Foundry has been huge among some of our enterprise customers. You saw that on stage. How many people this morning went to the keynote? How many people got a laugh? Okay. that was a lot of fun. What's that? Everyone in the room. Good, good. Hopefully not too much at our expense, but it's funny, and I made some minor edits to the deck this morning just to kind of address some of Sebastian's concerns there, which is great. It's great to have that dialogue. We've got an exciting partnership with Pivotal and a huge enterprise base. Gil, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Sure. So I have been with Microsoft about 4 years. Before then, I really came from mostly non-Microsoft background. I've done almost exclusively open source work since I've gone here and since I've been here at Microsoft. And I really focus on making ISV successful on the Azure cloud. That's what I've done since I started.
Cool. So the title namesake here, actually, keep calm. It's not like there's a war going on or something like that we're trying to keep you calm for. It was interesting to see. You walk into the community hub and you see huge Microsoft and huge Google, and you're like, am I at the right conference? I mean, Java, Spring, and talking to Microsoft and Google being side by side. There's no war. This actually came out of one of our first major deployments of Pivotal Cloud Foundry on Azure. We had a big customer, a big automaker. They may be speaking at this conference. This was the first time we went to production with a very large-scale service running PCF on Azure. And needless to say, the CIO was a little bit concerned. And she told everyone to bring their toothbrushes. It was going to be a long weekend when they did this deployment. And what you see here in the background, this is Microsoft, Pivotal, and this automaker's employees all together, all showing their toothbrushes. And the motto, this is actually Hayden Ryan came up with this. He's one of the platform architects from Pivotal who is lead on this project. He came up with this saying, "Keep calm and CF push on Azure." So it's resonated, and testament behind there is all 100% greens. That's all the services up and running, and it's been successful for a few months now that we've had this big, large-scale deployment out there. So this is my net new slide after this morning's talk. And I just wanted to reinforce that, it's a new world at Microsoft. We are definitely embracing open source, embracing Java and the development community, and we're really actually very, very happy and excited to be here. And you heard that from Corey Sanders, who drives all of our compute. He's responsible for not only the compute, which is virtual machine storage and networking, but he's also responsible, ironically, for our platform as a service. So Microsoft have their own platform as a service, but it's, we're embracing what customers are choosing and the direction they're going. We're seeing enterprises with Java and .NET, right? And Service Fabric, which is our own platform as a service, it's got some Java support coming, but it's classically a .NET environment. It's been promoted that way initially. We're really looking at enterprises like this big automaker, like Manulife, like a bunch of other customers. We had a presentation from Merrill Corporation, big financial services. They do virtual data rooms, mergers and acquisitions, heavy compliance, security, regulatory type of things. They're doing PCF in Azure in public cloud using Java and Spring Boot and a bunch of the Spring frameworks to deploy their microservices and transform their business. So we're seeing, but they also have .NET as well, and so we see a mix of .NET and Java in a lot of these customers. And so PCF does run .NET. It actually runs quite well. We're working through some of Sebastian's comments this morning, but both of those environments will run. What we're primarily here to talk about is kind of Java and Spring as the enablers for microservices hosted on Cloud Foundry in Azure. We have in the Azure environment both Windows and Linux. Corey made a comment on stage that we're seeing more and more Linux. Make that more concrete, about 30% of all new virtual machines spun up on our IaaS right now are Linux. That number's growing. We project that number to be over 50% within the next year or so. And so we see a lot of interest in the enterprise and running Linux. And honestly, in the cloud, servers are cattle, they're not pets, right? So we kind of really don't care what the server OS is in the cloud. It's all about spinning, and if you get to dollars and cents from a Microsoft perspective, is this just lip service? Well, no. I mean, we make money. It doesn't matter whether you're running Linux or Windows out there. What we then look at is some of those higher level services. How can we differentiate? We've got some machine learning with Cortana Analytics. We've got big data, and actually we work with Pivotal closely in their big data suite running in Azure as well. So there's a bunch of higher level services, and Gil's going to get into details about how you can take advantage of those from your Java apps in, in Azure using Cloud Foundry. I also wanted to obviously, the .NET on PCF, I put an asterisk. There's, if you download our deck after the fact, you will see there's some guidance, step-by-step guidance, how to get started with your first .NET app on Cloud Foundry on Azure. And by the way, this isn't just Pivotal Cloud Foundry. It is open source Cloud Foundry. We'll explain how that works in a second, but obviously a very close alignment with Pivotal here. And steeltoe.io, recent, I think there's a session, I should have alluded to it, but there's a session on some of the Spring capabilities coming to .NET, some of the semantics and so forth, Spring Cloud, config server, et cetera, coming to Azure and coming to the .NET framework that is an open source project there that you can get involved in.
I think that's tomorrow morning.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, so just to kind of reinforce some of the open source solutions. So it's not just that we woke up one morning and said, hey, we're going to do Pivotal Cloud Foundry on Azure. It's really a movement at Microsoft to embrace open source. Customers are asking us for it, and we want to make sure, as Corey says, that it runs beautifully on Azure. Everything from infrastructure on up to the application stack. And it is about choice. So when you look at whether or not you want to run Red Hat Linux, or you want to run Ubuntu, or you just don't care. You just want ultimately it to run inside of containers. We have a container service that uses either Docker Swarm or Mesosphere for orchestration. Databases. So big partnership with Hortonworks, and we've got something called HD Insight. We do big data on Azure. Cloudera, Cassandra. All sorts of the big data, structured SQL, NoSQL databases, frameworks, run any language, whether it be .NET, Java, Node, Python, PHP, you name it, obviously Java. And then, I actually should have drawn Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and that's an old Cloud Foundry logo, as most astute people will recognize. Obviously, that spans, right, the DevOps to the development story, so it doesn't necessarily fit the bands. But we're partnering with all of these companies. I think the partnership with Pivotal is very, very strong, though, around the enterprise interest there. One of our differentiators, Azure as a cloud, and I present this because I think there's some folks who, didn't recognize you could run Java on Azure, and it didn't really recognize what Azure as a public cloud was. We do have a huge footprint. And this is, Microsoft had a legacy of hundreds of data centers that supported the old, not the old, but Bing and Office Online and a bunch of the other properties. We've been in this business for a very long time about running global data centers. Specifically Azure data centers, we've got 34 regions that have been announced. 26 of them are online today. We continue to open them up. We're opening them up, as you heard, Manulife's taking advantage of it in Canada. We're kind of a first mover there. We've got them coming online in the UK, in Europe. We have more in Germany. We have a partnership with a company called 21 Vianet, which is hosting Azure in China. For all sorts of legal reasons, we don't want to own that. We can't own it. And customers don't want us to be part of that. But yet, 21 Vianet takes our recipe, takes our software, our bits, that makes the underlying service available and runs it on their their company, all of our specs running in China. We've got data centers in Asia Pac and India, all over the world. So we've got twice the number of regions than AWS. We don't necessarily have as much compute necessarily. We're, I'd say, very openly admit we're number 2 in that game in terms of overall scale, but we're growing at an incredible rate and continue to announce more and more data centers. Government data centers as well. We have a lot of government customers that want to run in a government-specific cloud. And the Merrill Corporation's presentation was great, being a very compliance and regulatory heavy environment. They allude to the reason in choosing Azure behind some of our compliance, PCI and ISO 27001 and so forth. I want to also mention that another compelling part of the Microsoft Cloud story in Azure is that in the future we will have a nice bridge for hybrid, which many of our enterprise customers have asked us for, symmetry between my on-prem cloud and my public cloud, and I want to blur that line. So a lot of the capabilities that make the public cloud happen, a lot of the infrastructure automation aspects of things, those will be ported to the local private cloud as well in something called Azure Stack, which is going to come out later next year as part of Windows Server 2016, which gets launched this year. Pivotal Cloud Foundry in general is going to run great. It uses the same resourcing model in the private cloud as it does in the public cloud. So you'll be able to take PCF and run it on-prem, run it in the public cloud transparently. So how does Cloud Foundry on Azure work? So I went to the CF Summit a while back and was working the booth, and a bunch of people came to me and was like, so wait a second, Azure is Cloud Foundry? So kind of upside down picture in my mind, but it was logical. Some people just didn't quite understand where it fit in the mix. And so if you look at that global footprint of data centers that we have, take that is your core infrastructure, your compute, your storage, your networking, and all of the security and whatnot that lays on top of that. Then we came along and built the cloud provider interface, which is the glue that abstracts Cloud Foundry from the underlying infrastructure. It's the capability for your code to run in Azure, in AWS, in Google, vSphere, wherever, without your code ever knowing about it, right? So Cloud Foundry takes care of all that magic. It's up to the infrastructure provider to create that intermediary layer. And that's called the Cloud Provider Interface. We've got dedicated engineers that are focused on this and continuing to evolve it as our infrastructure evolves. So that interface is used by Bosch, if you're familiar with that. That's really the bootstrapper for Cloud Foundry. That deploys, in this case, Pivotal Cloud Foundry to Azure on our infrastructure, consuming the VMs, consuming storage, consuming the services. From your developer dial tone, UCF push, and magically your applications are running, on top of that platform as a service on our IaaS. Does all the routing, et cetera, all those capabilities taken care of for you by Pivotal Cloud Foundry. This eye chart, I bring this up a little bit of a shock and awe. This is like the complete spectrum of all the things that are available in Azure. Everything from that underlying data center infrastructure on up through the higher level services. Some of these things could be construed as redundant with Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and it's about choice, right? So you could choose to use some of the core .NET capabilities of Service Fabric as a PaaS, or you could use Pivotal Cloud Foundry. Where we really shine well together is when you take advantage of Pivotal Cloud Foundry as a platform, running your Java microservices enabled through Spring, made easy through Spring, and then consume some of these higher level services. And that's where I'm going to hand off to my counterpart, Gil.
Thanks, Jason.
Hockey app is a testing app for mobile applications. It actually came through the acquisition of Xamarin. So Microsoft bought Xamarin a year ago or so. That was one of their apps. Yeah. And I will absolutely take questions. I'll come back around after Gil talks a little more technically.
All right, thanks, Jason. So this is a developer view of Cloud Foundry on Azure. So it's meant to be kind of a process view, the sort of underlying services that a developer would expect to see there when they're building an application, and then underneath the IaaS tier is kind of there, right? So has anybody here used any service brokers in Cloud Foundry? Okay, cool, excellent. So you'll recognize some of this. So the question is, that eye chart that Jason was showing, and it's an ever-growing eye chart of value-add services that Azure is adding, how do I access those? And as I alluded to, the answer is Service Broker. So what does a Service Broker give to you? It gives you lifecycle management, credentials, pre-configured options. It makes it easy. So from a developer standpoint, again, if anybody was at the keynote, I love that the McKesson guy was talking about yak shaving. This is exactly the stuff that developers can't stand, is what the Service Broker does for you. So I just want to take you through a quick example of a Service Broker in Azure. And this is based on a standard demo that we have in the Azure library. So if you go out, and I'll show you the GitHub project for this, but if you go out and you just search for Azure Document DB to do, you'll find this project. And it's a really straightforward Java project. And actually, the first time I worked with it, I just followed the instructions, put in my credentials, and I was actually able to just deploy it to Cloud Foundry. The problem with that is I had to really understand how I connect to my document DB. I had to put the credentials into my code, and especially if you think of that in an enterprise mode, that's really a big challenge for a developer, right? How do I get all those permissions, credentials, networking, blah, blah, right? So this is kind of a picture of that. You know, the poor developer, he's got his to-do app that he wants, his to-do app that he wants to deploy into Cloud Foundry, and somehow he wants to connect to Document DB. And Document DB is a NoSQL document store platform as a service. So the first thing is the operators will figure out, well, what kind of options do they want to give developers? They'll figure out plans. They'll figure out what the credentials are. They'll create an account, and that's where your databases go in Document DB. They go into a Document DB account. And they'll essentially package that as a service broker. And a service broker is something that is only executed when you're creating a service. So that's the first step. And there's a very straightforward command line interface in Cloud Foundry. Has anybody used the CF command line? Okay, great. So a little bit preaching to the choir here. Then when they want to create the actual database for their application, the to-do database, they create an instance of that service, and that actually goes out and talks to the underlying IaaS. Again, the developer does not have to know how that's done. The next thing is just CF push the application. You can actually, are those colors? No, colors are kind of messed up there, but there are ways to push directly out of Eclipse, but you know, the straightforward way to package an app is just CF push it, right? And then the next thing is that the application needs those credentials in its environment variables, and that's called VCAP services in Cloud Foundry. And so you do what's called a bind. So you bind the application to this service, right? There's a lot of stuff happening under the scene, under the covers, as a result of just using these simple commands. So let's take a look at this. So first off, here is my actual application, simple to-do app, and I just want to say, go to Spring One platform. It's maybe a conference category, and you know, just like you would expect, it adds it to the to-do list. And has anybody used the Azure console? Okay, fewer people. So this is our UI. A lot of people just really love using this. It's really easy to use, very intuitive UI. I'm here in my Document DB account, and this is the database. And if I go over here and look at my collections, I will see that it has several records. And I can see the record that I added. I think it's the last one. Let's see. Right. So here you can see that was done, and this was all running in Cloud Foundry, right? So let's take a look at, let's just take a quick look at the code difference, right? So as I mentioned, this is the GitHub project, and as I mentioned before, the only way that this application knows how to do stuff is to just put code right in to the app, okay? If we take a look at the Cloud Foundry version, we can see that it is now, there's no credentials in here, and it's talking to VCAP services, right? So let's look at this from the command line standpoint. So first of all, here's my app that's running. So I have the DocumentDB app, and here are my services that are available to me to provision. So what happens when you create a service broker is you get this marketplace with plans. And you can see that some of these have different plans, right? So bronze, gold, there's a bunch of different services. Mine actually happens to be this one, the DocumentDB 714 service. So when I provision a service, and I'll just do a sample one here. So I actually did this command before. I created one, and I called it the test add. Let's call it test add 2. And there's actually a configuration file where I can name the specific database for myself in Azure, right? So I just changed the configuration file, and now I create the service. This is going to be, I'm using the standard plan of the GI DocumentDB 714 service broker in the marketplace, and I'm going to call it test add 2. So while that's talking to Azure, let's just look at the other services that I've created. So you can see here test add 2, well, I actually created already, but what you can also see is the one I created previously that my to-do app is using, and you can see that it actually knows that it's bound there. So if I look at the environment for this app, tr document db to-do app, and I just page back up, you can see here are my credentials, right? So the service, by creating that service instance, it knows the credentials, the location information for this DocumentDB database, and when I bind them, it puts them into, are we?
Keep talking.
Oh, sorry. It puts them into the environment so that I can navigate them in my application. And then this is kind of like straight JSON that we did here and talking to some Spring libraries. There's actually stuff we're looking at doing to make it more like the Spring connector mechanism that you have for a lot of other services. So, I mean, again, this is stuff we really kind of experimental to see, like, could we do this? And so just to show you, like, the end result of provisioning this database, let's go back all the way to here. And so you can see that from Cloud Foundry, when I created that database, and again, this is transparent to the developer, here's the one that I specified, GI piece, so that's the new database. And I could unbind from the other one and bind to this and run the app against it. The bind takes a little bit of time, so we didn't want to do that during the demo. But you can see here how really from a very simple set of commands, we're abstracting all of this stuff away from the developer. And they just have to say, well, I want to use this cloud service. And there's a service that someone's built for me in Cloud Foundry to do it. So,
do you want to switch back to
what I wanted to show you? This was the last slide.
Yep.
You can just put that up there.
Cool. So, awesome. Thank you, Gil. That was a really good demonstration of how you can use, from a Java application, take advantage of some of the services in Azure, a NoSQL database in this case, through a service broker mechanism that's enabled in Cloud Foundry. So what I wanted to wrap up.
I have to interrupt you one quick second. I cannot leave this demo without giving credit to Rich Zeroder, Ellie, and someone who isn't here, Colin Stevenson, who really backed us up. So it also speaks to the partnership. So sorry.
I want to thank my mom, and I want no.
Yeah, and my agent,
the academy. So just wrapping up, this has been a wild year. So we embarked on this, and Kundana is in the audience as well, who is one of the lead engineers in core engineering in Azure that helped drive some of the CPI work, and it's been a wild ride. We really announced the GA of that CPI only in November of 2015, and since then, just a ton of enterprise interest in running Cloud Foundry and specifically PCF on Azure. The open source Cloud Foundry is generally available. PCF's fully supported on Azure. We have a marketplace solution that, and these are, thanks to Gil, these are all live links that when you download the deck. If you want to try PCF and you've got a very big quota, PCF is a big, complex beast. It doesn't always have to be, right? But there's lots of VMs to create an entire platform, and so you can deploy it in a single click through our Azure Marketplace. So if you go to that link, and then all of the work that we've done on the CPI, all of the work that we're doing on the service brokers, it's all open source. So it's all being contributed by our engineers into this GitHub repository. You can go check that out. Please feel free to make a pull request. As there are more services that as customers you want to take advantage of in Azure, we'll add, or you can add, service brokers. It's a fairly lightweight piece of code to build. So by all means, we want to encourage community contribution, and we'll continue, and we're committed to continuing to contribute to that. Scott Guthrie is kind of our spiritual leader, right? He's responsible for all of our enterprise business and has been a big developer advocate for a very long time. And he, has committed to Azure being a great place to run Java, and PCF being a great environment to run that on. Michael Dell, Dell Technologies, is about to acquire EMC and VMware, and by virtue of that, Pivotal and be a large stakeholder there. Dell is actually running PCF on Azure. So great tweet from Michael after one of our conferences, and we've had just a bunch of really good press that's come out, and we've got some good customer examples, and it's all really heating up. So. Oh, actually, I don't have the clicker. you got it. There you go. So this is, if you want to go check out the marketplace, there's a link there as well, and an SDK for Java on Azure. So the service brokers enable you to consume, the provision, consume, bind, but you also, everything's available as a RESTful API, but then there's Java classes on top of that wrap it and make it easier for you. So with that, I think we've got like a minute or two, anyways, that we're happy to take questions and feedback, or just follow up with us offline. Sir?
How many of those service brokers have you put out there?
I think there's 5, right? DocumentDB, our blob storage is there, Redis Cache, so we have a version of our own Redis Cache in Azure. Azure SQL Database, so that's our database as a service. There is in that in the open source. It's not GA yet. It's still in beta. But I think within a couple of weeks we'll have that. I know there's a couple people heavily beta testing that. What am I missing?
Service Bus and Event Hub.
Thank you.
And that's an open source project. So the link in the presentation will take you there. You can look at it.
Yeah, sir.
Can you comment on how Microsoft plans to support .NET microservices?
Yeah. Comment on how does Microsoft plan to support .NET microservices in Azure? So, microservices just being an architectural pattern, of course. There are a lot of great things that Spring offers that take some of the configuration and pain of lifting and building these microservices. So there's folks from Pivotal that are collaborating with us on steeltoe.io, which will blend some of the, so there's the Spring Cloud config server and attributes added in .NET to be able to pull in config information and whatnot. That makes it a little bit easier. But there's also, Mark Krasinovich is our CTO for Azure. He's got a blog post. He talks about our microservices strategy in one of those blog posts as well. It's a fairly recent one, a couple months old. I'd go take a look at that. But there's definitely architectural patterns and practices out there about building .NET microservices. Fundamentally, you'll see a big investment from Microsoft in open sourcing .NET. It's already C# and .NET, and a lot of the framework has been open sourced. There's an emphasis on growing what we call .NET Core. So that is .NET that is portable to run on Linux or on Windows, and so whether you run it on Linux or Windows, fundamentally it isn't really going to matter all that much as we continue to grow what's in .NET Core and the open source initiative around that. Does that kind of help?
For the enterprise that has a monolithic .NET app using integrated with development
Yeah, so a couple things there. If you're using PCF, for instance, you have the UAA in Cloud Foundry. So there's integration between the UAA and Active Directory, Azure Active Directory to be very specific. It's all SAML based. So that's one. You know, what you just stated, the monolith, like there's no magic, right? As we've heard from many of these presentations, you have to decompose some of that. It's not a classical n-tier architecture anymore. So it's fundamentally breaking that apart. But can you take advantage of authentication? Can you take advantage of IIS and Windows, et cetera? Absolutely. There is the capability to have Windows machines behind PCF as well. Yeah. I think last question. We got a minute.
Yeah. So to get PCF going on an Azure instance,
yep.
It takes 32 cores or something like that. It's insane.
Yeah. There's a lot of VMs. Yeah.
So is there any work going on there to sort of minimize the amount of workload that you need to sort of get that going?
Yeah, two things. I mean, number one, production deployments are very large. You know, we work closely with Pivotal, Gil specifically, to craft an environment that could be like a fully production environment. So when you stood up PCF on Azure, you got the kitchen sink. We've realized now that, so if you go to the marketplace, it's 53 VMs is technically what deploys. And so we're working with Pivotal closely to our learnings from that to say, hey, maybe we don't need everything. Like how many MySQL databases do we need? Could we use some of the database services? Do we really need RabbitMQ for these environments, et cetera? So can we pare down some of the VMs and get it to a reasonable size? So it's just a function of how Pivotal and we work together and Microsoft work together to create that manifest that gets deployed. I mean, ultimately you could run, in my vision as a developer is that you could run, PCF Dev. I think it used to be called Lattice. Run that in a single VM, and just to play with it and test.
You could also look at the open source GA guidance, and you can configure whatever deployment of Cloud Foundry you want. So,
yeah.
That's totally flexible, right? That could be a single VM deployment.
So I think we're out of time, but we're around. So please come on up and ask questions. Happy to help you out and even get you connected if you're interested in doing this with the Pivotal and Microsoft account teams. So thank you very much. Thank you, Gil.